Oh, this is gonna be crazy.
Okay, destroy the building.
Alright, so hello everyone and welcome to another edition of SpraynPray1000's Verdict. I am SpraynPray1000 and today I'm going to talk about a series of games that's actually pretty close to my heart. And while the games themselves are not exactly the newest, the game compilation has just recently been re-released for Wii U. And I feel it's a good time to actually air my thoughts about, the entire franchise as a whole, because I've grown up alongside it, and in general, it's very, very important to not only my gaming history, but a lot of my childhood memories as well. The Metroid Prime Trilogy, which is composed of Metroid Prime, which was originally released in 2002, Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, which was originally released in 2004, and Metroid Prime 3, which was originally released in 2007. And Metroid is a science fiction franchise, Nintendo franchise, set in, the typical kind of galactic civilization, and it stars special, unique bounty hunter Samus Aran as she ventures around the galaxy solving mysteries and helping people in need. Now, Samus, of course, is armed with for her perilous journeys with her Chozo power suit, the Chozo being a now extinct or disappeared race of aliens who took Samus in when she was an orphan. And Samus has numerous run-ins with longtime enemies, some, like Ridley, others more recent, such as Metroid Prime 2, the Ing. And the Metroid Prime Trilogy really recaps a very different, interesting new chunk of Metroid games. For instance, almost every Metroid game, I believe, in fact, every Metroid game before Metroid Prime was a 2D side-scroller. It was not what Metroid Prime is, and its other game sequels are first-person shooters. You actually play from the perspective inside of Samus's helmet, and you use, at least in this version, instead of using the GameCube, which really didn't have a traditional first-person shooter style setup with two sticks, you use the Wii Remote and the nunchuck in this HD collection, right on the tongue, in this recompilation in order to solve your way through puzzles, combat enemies, and explore the world around you. Now, on the surface, every single iteration of Metroid Prime plays pretty similarly, although a lot of things have been changed for Metroid Primes 1 and 2 in order to better fit them to the Wii Remote setup, because originally these games were GameCube games and used an entirely different controller altogether. Now, in the collection, I do not believe it is possible to return to the GameCube controller settings or use a GameCube controller. But however, and this is going to be one of the first things that I say about the gameplay of the first two games, it has been fine-tuned and made in some cases better, because remember, in the original GameCube release, you could not aim all over the screen, but when they made Metroid Prime 3, that's one of the biggest gameplay changes that they added, that you can lock onto an enemy and freely move about and freely aim Samus's arm cannon at whichever enemy you so please. That makes certain segments of the game tremendously easier, because you no longer have to root yourself in place while you look around to aim at something higher up. And it certainly helps fix a lot of different problems and issues with Metroid Prime 1 and 2, like certain boss fights and such, which was actually one of the major criticisms of Metroid Prime 2, was the difficulty of the boss encounters. But let's start from the top. The story of Metroid Prime begins immediately after the original Metroid, or Zero Mission, as some people use that, where Samus Aran responds to a desolated space pirate frigate. Upon landing, she encounters her old rival, Ridley, who then flees down to the planet it's orbiting, called Talon 4. After escaping, Samus loses her abilities, the typical sort of thing in a Metroid game, and thus begins her journey to travel Talon 4, reclaim some of her old abilities, gain tons of new ones, and also put a stop to the space pirate menace All the while, there is a mysterious threat from the weird materials that are found on the planet called phazon, a liquid-style ore, kind of a little bit similar visually to like mercury if it was blue. Mercury, the metal, the element. And as such, the game basically takes off from there. Now, Metroid Prime 1 is the first game, well, obviously it's the first game in the trilogy. Samus plays you play as Samus as you explore, and it's a very similar style thing to, say, like Zelda, if you're familiar with how Zelda games play. So the entire game, while there is sequence breaking, or at least there was in the GameCube version, certainly there's a lot of things. The basic premise of the game is still very, very similar and very, very straightforward. You go from one area to the next. You know, your previously unlocked ability allows you to either traverse something you couldn't before, unlock something you couldn't before, or fight an enemy, or you're usually a boss, that will allow you to progress to a new area, which will allow you to get another ability. Very, very similar to a Zelda game, where it's sort of the usual. You get an item, it helps you through the dungeon, you fight the dungeon boss, you get another item, something like that. You know, it's a very similar progression style that they use between the two different games. The reason why I like Metroid over the average Zelda game, however, is because of the first-person involvement, the sci-fi aspects, and certainly the different various things that you have to do. So for instance, you know, Samus has a wide arsenal of weapons. In this game, you can change which weapon you use. You can change the beam on Samus's arm cannon and use that for different puzzles or enemies. Some enemies are completely resistant to your beam. Others are, you know, weak to it. Some are just indifferent. It'll do normal damage. There's also tons of Morph Ball, which is Samus's alternate form, where she turns into a ball approximately, I think, 3 meters in diameter. That certainly also adds to different puzzles, because then you have some segments that are Morph Ball only, and you have to use Samus's bombs, power bombs, new movement systems such as the Boost Ball and the Spider Ball in order to traverse various environments and to solve puzzles and to get collectibles and pickups, and also to defeat enemies. Samus also has use of something called the Scan Visor, which is very similar to, say, a Zelda-style helper. It gives you information about various objects in the world, various enemies, you know, research, you know, items that you might find interesting, and in general helps you progress through the game. And also, for the people who like a little challenge, also allows them to, say, try to get 100% of the logbook, which is a mandatory, well, not a mandatory thing, it's an optional thing you can do for more story and other things such and such, which is kind of similar to, say, a game like Dark Souls, or, you know, any From Software game where most of the story is told to you not through cutscenes, but rather through item descriptions and, you know, putting vague hints together. While Metroid Prime isn't as vague, certainly a lot of the story is not really explained to you outright, and in fact a lot of it is acquired through reading space pirate data, through finding and reading Chozo lore, which is on walls throughout the world, you know, finding different items. That it's basically almost the same, a precursor, if you will, sort of, although I won't say that they took the exact idea. It's very, very similar. Unlike a lot of other games, other Metroid games, where the story is either, you know, kind of non-existent because it's an old-style game, and it's more in the manuals and such, or, you know, where the story is kind of outright told to you, like Metroid Fusion and Other M, such and such. And Metroid Prime 1, I mean, admittedly, if you know what to do, it's very, very short, you know, like a lot of older games these days, but certainly there's a lot of replayability, there's a lot of bonus stuff you can get. All the unlockables from the first Metroid game, I believe, return for this. You can get Samus in the Fusion suit, because Metroid Prime and Metroid Fusion launched at almost the same day, I believe. You can actually, one of the cool things about the GameCube version is if you link the two together, you could have Samus in the Fusion suit in Metroid Prime 1 and some other things in Fusion if you went the other way about it. But that also returns, and there's tons of all the artwork and everything returns, and it's just a really great experience. And definitely Metroid Prime 1 is one of my favorite games of all time. Without a doubt, this game is just so different, so unique, and even to this day still has a good air of freshness about it that really even the other Metroid Prime sort of may surpass it in one or two categories, but overall, the general idea of it really doesn't nothing really holds a candle to it, in my opinion, besides one or two other games, also around the GameCube era that I really, really enjoyed and really, really played, and I really did a lot of stuff with as a kid. You know, I played hours upon hours of these games, and they became my favorites. I absolutely adore and love them. Now, the one thing I will say is I think that they made normal mode easier than the original GameCube release. I believe that they might have added a mode that's much easier, because playing through it, I remembered just kind of almost breezing through it. Now, I'd have to actually, compare the two versions side by side, but I don't really remember it being that easy. So they might have added a new normal mode that's easier, and then veteran mode is probably, if you were a veteran of the GameCube version, etc., etc. The second game in the series is Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, which was released 2 years after Metroid Prime 1. Echoes features Samus I think an unknown period of time later. I think it might be 2 years or something. I'm not too sure about the time frame, but certainly it takes place after Metroid Prime Hunters, which is not in this collection, which is a DS game. Involves Samus taking up a contract with the Galactic Federation to find out what happened to one of their missing ships that went missing as it circled a planet called Aether. Upon landing, Samus' ship is damaged and she is marooned on the planet, and she becomes involved in a conflict between a peaceful race of warriors in the Light World, or our dimension, called the Luminoth, and their dark counterparts, the Ing, which are also born from Phazon. And Samus's journey, again, has her tracking down upgrades she loses near the start of it, traversing this dark environment called Dark Aether, a dark shadow of the light version of Aether, with hostile atmosphere and even more hostile enemies. Pretty similar premise. This time around, there's a couple of different things. So, for instance, this game introduces an ammo system, which is one of the more disappointing aspects of the game, I feel. The ammo system kind of doesn't really feel too great. Now, the reason I say that is because you end up using the light beam much more than any other beam in the game. In fact, and because of the fact that you only get a limited amount of ammo, the power beam is basically effective against just about every enemy in the game. There's multiple ways to defeat enemies in this game, which is one thing I like. But, however, the fact that you only have limited amounts of ammo can make it very difficult and annoying if you don't find all the different ammo caches that will up your supply. So, most certainly, that's something that kind of I wasn't really feeling too much. Typically, Samus has infinite ammo in most of her abilities, which is really what allows her to do what she does. Now, the other thing I do like about this game, however, is I do like the boss complexity. I do like the fact that, unlike in Metroid Prime 1, where bosses typically have one phase and maybe they changed, small minor things, bosses in Metroid Prime 2 have clearly defined multiple phases, which is really, really awesome. And it really adds to the, as I say, the boss complexity really adds to the feel of the game, and that's the one thing I do like about this game, is I do like the bosses. Now, sure, they're difficult, but the one thing I will say is that the inclusion of the Spring Ball, which is a common Metroid upgrade in the 2D games, and was included in Metroid Prime 3, really helps out in this game, because in the GameCube version it didn't exist. It made the game a lot more difficult, because you had to wait for a bomb to go off before you could do a Morph Ball bomb jump. Well, now they got rid of that, because you can just flick the Spring Ball, or flick the Wii Remote to make Samus jump in ball mode instantly, no delay. And that's certainly what made a lot of different bosses in Metroid Prime 2 very difficult. Also worth noting that this game is one of the few Metroid games, I even say that it might be the only Metroid game to feature Morph Ball only boss fights, which again, now having the Spring Ball makes it a lot easier and a lot more fun. I do like that. I think it was a very helpful addition to the game, and it certainly just goes to show that they really kind of added a lot of cool stuff later on that I'm glad they were able to, remix and add back into the Metroid Prime games of old. And And other than that, I mean, the game plays very similarly to Metroid Prime 1. Where, there's a few UI changes, a few things that are upgraded and such. But otherwise, the game is just almost the exact same. It plays very similarly, very, very faithfully, while adding new stuff and visiting new locations. Now, Metroid Prime 2 did have a multiplayer mode, which does return in some capacity in this game. Now, I don't know how much effective that is, although it's at least cool that they didn't just simply drop it. I think it's good that it's in there, but really I don't give any points for it because it really feels kind of crammed in. It's split screen multiplayer, and it's pretty simplistic. Nothing major. I mean, if you have a friend, sure, you might want to mess around with it for a while, but otherwise it's not to die for. Let me put it like that. I don't think it's really anything that someone's going to cry out for so much. The main meat of the entire trilogy is replaying the single player experiences. And now, lastly, I'll get to Metroid Prime 3, which probably had the fewest changes between its original release and the trilogy release, just simply because it was already a Wii game and all they really did was package the other two games with it. Metroid Prime Trilogy takes place 6 months after after Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, where Samus now is certainly aware that the dark presence that she encountered in Echoes, a darker version of herself called Dark Samus, is now posing a galactic threat. Dark Samus is now free around the universe and is wreaking havoc, launching these gigantic worm creatures called Leviathans at planets and spreading Phazon throughout the galaxy. And Samus's goal in this game is to stop the spread of Phazon and defeat her dark nemesis once and for all. Now, the controls of this game are, as I said before, it's Wii Remote style. You can look anywhere. This is the game that really originated that whole look around anywhere controls, and so obviously it fits the most naturally into the game. There's bosses that require you to gun around various parts of their body, while looking around with the Wiimote, while dodging their attacks. The one thing I will say about this game is that the areas are kind of simple. The areas are certainly not as complex as Metroid Prime 2 or say Metroid Prime 1. The one thing I also will add is that the gunship, you can actually control Samus's gunship in this game. They make you collect missiles for it, and it's really like for no purpose. I really don't see why you would want to collect missiles for Samus's gunship. They don't really add that much, I want to say, to the gameplay of the game. You only use them maybe 2 or 3 times, and just the pickups for them, it just feels like something that I guess they were kind of working on, and they kind of just kept it in some capacity, but it really doesn't add a ridiculous amount to the game. Now, the things I do like, the graphics. The graphics of this game are really, really, really well done for the time. They really help bring to light the various parts of Samus's suit, as well as the corruption that she begins to undergo, the corruption from the title. And they basically do a really good job of presenting this game. I mean, there's tons of explosions, there's a lot of dialogue, voice acting for a Metroid game, extensive amounts of voice acting. A lot of people put a lot of time into, writing the script and having all these characters interact. Well, Samus herself is still a silent protagonist. She doesn't speak at all. Whether she really doesn't speak at all or the dialogue is left to your imagination is up to you. And other than that, the gameplay of it is pretty straightforward and pretty well done, and I do enjoy it quite a good bit. The only thing I will say is that Metroid Prime 3 really kind of has simplistic stuff in it. Like, it doesn't feel as in-depth to the same degree as Metroid Prime 1 and 2. There's not the fights don't have as many phases. The areas are pretty, point A to point B. Doesn't really have the same feeling of exploration I used to really admire about Metroid Prime 1 and 2. But nonetheless, the game does a great job at delivering its strengths, delivering a nice conclusion to the trilogy. And certainly one that will be memorable. The biggest feature I'll say is that it goes back to the traditional Metroid beam stacking, where you basically only have one beam as opposed to switching beams, which is what you do in the first 2 Metroid Primes. But You also, in this game, get something called Hyper Mode, which allows Samus to inject one of her energy tanks so that she can enter a brief buff where she can shoot pure Phazon. And at this point, she becomes invincible to most attacks. She can deal a large amount of damage over a certain period of time. And it becomes a very integral part of the game in order to deal with some of the more annoying enemies, to kill them very quickly in a few shots at the cost of some health. And managing it becomes a big problem because if you stay in it too long, you end up with a game over if you can't control it. And in general, the game really does its best to try and change things up. Bosses really don't take a lot of damage unless you hit them with Hyper Mode, so it becomes both a blessing and a curse, a necessity and sort of a detriment to Samus's health. I guess it will make the boss fights a little bit more tactical on higher difficulties, although on lower difficulties you can kind of just blast your way through everything. And all in all, the trilogy wraps up so nicely that it has a nice UI from which you pick between the three games for doing key things in each game, such as, say, defeating a boss, getting vital scans, completing various things, progressing through certain points of the game. You get something called credits, and each credit is of a different color, and each game has different colors assigned to it. And replaying the game and doing various actions in Metroid Prime 3, such as stylish kills and whatnot, protecting people, preventing any of them from dying and such, will reward you with credits. In the first two games, it's a bit more simplistic because the original releases did not have this system. And it's basically limited to scans and, defeating bosses. And the whole UI is very nice. I really want to say that this is one of the better HD collections, HD remasters, etc. that I've ever played in my life. And certainly I got it for 10. I think it went back up to 20 now. For $10 or $20, this is probably one of the better experiences that you could probably find out there right now. As opposed to, say, $60 remasters and such. I will give Metroid Prime Trilogy a spin. Because, in all honesty, it encompasses, 10 years of, I want to say, like the glory years of Metroid, where they constantly release good Metroid game after good Metroid game. And it's a blast. It's a ton of fun. And I'm going to go back and replay this on my own free time, but I am most certainly happy and glad that I was able to play the Metroid Prime Trilogy again currently. And that's really awesome, because I really enjoy these games, and I think that the presentation of all three, and just looking at it from the scope of not only now, but back then, they really hold up. They're really fun and involving adventures through three different areas, and are just, in general, games not to be missed. I think that every gamer should at least attempt one of these games, and the whole trilogy, now that it's, all done and everything, completely wrapped up nicely in a nice package. Very good. So, what would I give the Metroid Prime Trilogy? I mean, really, is it of any surprise that I'm going to give it a nice high score because of the polish and the care and just the involvement of the games? Between Metroid Prime 1's good feeling and good sense of exploration and just general well-balanced nature, Metroid Prime 2's gameplay and Metroid Prime 3's story and presentation, as well as all the graphics and music between the three games, this is going to get, without a doubt, a 96 out of 100 from me. I really, really appreciate the work and effort that they put into these games, even in their original releases and even now. The trilogy plays just as smoothly, if not smoother, than the original releases in all my experiences with it. And in general, it's very good and very nice to see that they took three games, then two of which are kind of old, and they really repackaged them and now made it even more available to people. That, to me, is the hallmark of a good trilogy. And I'm always a sucker for these HD remasters because a lot of good work was done back in the, years ago. And this is probably one of the best ones I think I've ever played, not only on my channel, but just in general. Just in general, the way that they took these games and they didn't just re-slap it together and make you buy an accessory. The way that they rebound the first two games for the Wiimote really makes them more fun and a lot better. Now, one of the biggest complaints I think I could say about this game, and it's kind of more of an unknown thing, is I believe in order to grapple consecutively between grapple points in the first game, you have to point the Wii remote all over the place. But that's really like the biggest thing that flies into my head. I mean, it's less so much as the problems aren't numerous enough as there are not really much to say. I mean, unless if this game is your kind of cup of tea, then you'll like it, you'll feel right at home, and you'll probably enjoy the other two games. I mean, that to me is just really, really great. I really enjoyed these games, and I think that they're great adventure games. And I'll even go as far as to say that I like them a lot better than some Zelda games. You know, the feeling of adventure and the feeling of using different items to progress, that really helps a lot with the game. So a 96 out of 100, great work. Without a doubt, a lot of energy and time put into this, and it really pays off in the end. Alright, so that's going to be it for this episode of The Verdict. I'm SpraynPray1000, and I will see you guys later. I will be talking with you. I will be doing playthroughs on various other games in some time, and I will see you guys soon. So take care. See you for either Type 0 or Wolfenstein the Old Blood.